don't really have a plan for this video, so I'll probably do something and then figure out a name for it and describe it afterwards, but as of right now, I don't have any kind of plan. I've got a book in front of me that I've been wanting to read, and I've got this little cup thing left over from the other day. Some of you might not like what I'm about to read, and that's okay. But I'm a very curious person. This book is State and Revolution. Chapter 1, Class, Society, and the State. What is now happening to Marx's doctrine What is now happening to Marx's doctrine has occurred time after time in history to the doctrine of revolutionary thinkers and leaders of oppressed classes struggling for liberation. The oppressing classes have constantly persecuted the great revolutionaries in their lifetime, reacted to their teachings with the most savage malice, the wildest hatred, and the most shameless campaigns of lies and slander. Attempts are made after their death to convert them into harmless icons, to canonize them, so to speak, and to confer a certain prestige on their names, so as to console the oppressed classes by emasculating the essence of the revolutionary teaching, blunting its revolutionary edge, and vulgarizing it. The bourgeoisie and the opportunists within the working class movement at the moment cooperate in this elaboration of Marxism. They forget, erase, and destroy the revolutionary side of this doctrine, its revolutionary soul. They push to the foreground and extol what is or seems acceptable to the bourgeoisie. All the social chauvinists are now Marxists. Oh, please don't laugh. And it is ever more frequent for German bourgeois scholars who only yesterday specialized in the destruction of Marxism to speak about the national German Marx, who allegedly educated the workers' union, which are so splendidly organized for the waging of a predatory war. In such circumstances, when there has been an unprecedented distortion of Marxism, our task is above all to re-establish Marx's authentic doctrine on the state. For this purpose, it will be necessary to adduce a whole series of lengthy quotations from the works of Marx and Engels themselves. Of course, long quotations will render the text wordy and will not help at all to make it popularly accessible, but we cannot possibly manage without them. All, or at any rate, all the crucial passages in the works of Marx and Engels on the state definitely must be quoted as fully as possible, so that the reader may have an independent idea of the totality of the views of the founders of scientific socialism and of the development of those views, and so that their distortion by the current dominant Kautskyism may be documentarily proved and clearly demonstrated. Let us start with the most popular of Engels' works, The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State, whose sixth edition appeared in Stuttgart as long ago as 1894. We shall have to translate the quotations from the German originals, since the Russian translations, despite being very numerous, are for the most part either incomplete or accomplished very unsatisfactorily. Summing up his historical analysis, Engels says, "The state is by no means a power forced on society from without. The state is equally not the reality of the ethical ideal idea, the image and reality of reason, as Hegel maintains. The state is a product of society at a certain stage of development. The state is the recognition that this society has become entangled in an irresolvable contradiction with itself. That it is divided into irreconcilable antagonisms which it is powerless to escape, but in order that these antagonisms, classes with conflicting economic interests, might not devour each other in society in sterile struggle, in a power seemingly standing above society became necessary for the purpose of moderating the conflict, keeping it within the bounds of order. And this power, which has arisen out of society but placed itself above it and increasingly alienated itself from it, is the state. So, summary, the state is a tool that maintains order and maintains the hierarchy of class. It is something that places itself above society and alienates itself from it. This expresses with complete clarity the basic idea of Marxism on the question of the historical role and significance of the state. The state is the product and the manifestation of the irreconcilability of class contradictions. The state arises where, when, and to the extent that class contradictions objectively cannot be reconciled. And conversely, the existence of the state demonstrates that the class contradictions are irreconcilable. So, what does it mean when it's saying that class contradictions are irreconcilable? The contradictions, so like the tug, but it's like a tug of war between different classes, and the fact that, well, I'm gonna let Lenin explain it. It is precisely on this most important and basic point that the distortion of Marxism, proceeding along two main lines, begins. On one hand, the bourgeois and the petty bourgeois ideologists, compelled under the pressure of indisputable historical facts to recognize that the state only exists where there are class contradictions and class struggle, correct Marx in such a way as to make it appear that the state is an organ for the reconciliation of classes. According to Marx, the state could neither arise nor endure if it were possible to reconcile classes. According to Marx, the state is an organ of class rule, an organ for the oppression of one class by another. It is the creation of order, legalizing and perpetuating this oppression by moderating the classes among the clashes among the classes. In the opinion of petty bourgeois politicians, order means precisely the reconciliation of classes, and not the oppression of one class by another. To moderate the conflict means to reconcile classes, and not to deprive the oppressed classes of definite means and methods of struggle for the overthrow of their oppressors. For instance, when in the Revolution of 1917 the question arose in all its magnitude about the significance and role of the state as a practical question demanding immediate action on a mass scale, all the SRs, socialist revolutionaries, and Mensheviks immediately and completely bowed down before the petty bourgeois theory of the reconciliation of classes by the state. Innumerable resolutions and articles by politicians of both these parties are thoroughly pervaded by this petty bourgeois and Philistine theory, that the state is an organ of the rule of a definite class which cannot be reconciled with its antipode, antipode means the class opposite to it, is something that the petty bourgeois Democrats can never understand. Their attitude towards the state is one of the most vivid manifestations of the fact that our SRs and Mensheviks are not socialists at all, a point that we Bolsheviks have always been able to demonstrate, but petty bourgeois Democrats with a quasi-socialist phraseology. On the other hand, the Kautskyite distortion of Marx is much subtler. Theoretically, it is not denied that the state is an organ of class rule, or that class contradictions are irreconcilable, but it is lost from the sight or fudged is the following. If the state is the product of the irreconcilability of class contradictions, if it is a power standing above society and increasingly alienating itself from society, then it is clear that the liberation of the oppressed classes is impossible not only without a violent revolution, but also without the destruction of the apparatus of state power which was created by the ruling class, and which is the incarnation of this alienation. So Lenin's saying that the only way out of it is through a violent revolution, but also the complete destruction of the state. He's clarifying Marx's point. As we shall see later, Marx most definitely drew this theoretically self-evident conclusion on the basis of a concrete historical analysis of the tasks of revolution, and as we show in detail in our further presentation, it is precisely this conclusion which Kautsky has forgotten and distorted. So that was the first part of chapter 1, and it was titled "The State as the Product of the Irreconcilability of Class Contradictions." This is part 2, Special Bodies of Armed Men, Prisons, etc. Engels continues. In contrast with the old Gentile, tribal or clan organization, the state is distinguished firstly by the division of the state's subjects according to territorial divisions. Such a division seems natural to us, but it cost a prolonged struggle against the old organization of tribal or Gentile society. The second distinguishing feature is the establishment of a public power, which no longer coincides directly with the population organizing itself as an armed force. This special public power is necessary because a self-motivating armed organization of the population has become impossible since the cleavage of society into classes. This public power exists in every state. It consists not only of armed people, but also of material adjuncts, prisons, and coercive institutions of all kinds, which are unknown to Gentile or clan society. Engels is developing the concept of power, which is called... This was all written by Engels. This next bit, Lenin continues to say, Engels is developing the concept of the power, which is called the state, a power which has arisen from society but places itself above it and alienates itself more and more from it. What does this power mainly consist of? It consists of special bodies of armed men with prisons, etc. at their command. We have the right to speak about special bodies of armed men because the public power characteristic of every state does not coincide directly with the armed population, with its self-acting armed organization. Let me reread that. We have the right to speak about special bodies of armed men because the public power characteristic of every state does not coincide directly with the armed population or with its self-acting armed organization. Like all great revolutionary thinkers, Engels tries to turn the attention of the class-conscious workers to the very fact which is treated by prevailing Philistinism Philistinism as being the least worthy of attention, as being the most habitual and sanctified by not only deep-rooted but arguably even petrified prejudices. A standing army and police are the chief instruments of state power. But can it be otherwise? Is there another way? From the viewpoint of the vast majority of Europeans at the end of the 19th century, whom Engels was addressing, and who had not lived through or closely observed a single great revolution, it could not be otherwise. For them, a self-motivating armed organization of the population was something completely incomprehensible. To the question why the need arose for special bodies of armed men, placed above society and alienating themselves from society. So police, the standing army, the West European and Russian Philistines are inclined to reply with a few phrases borrowed from Spencer or Mikhailovsky, referring to the growing complexity of social life, the differentiation of functions, etc. Such references seem scientific and wondrously befuddle the man in the street by obscuring the main and basic fact, the splitting of society into irreconcilably hostile classes. Were it not for this splitting, the self-motivated armed organization of the population would differ by virtue of its complexity, its high technical level, etc., from a primitive organization of a stick-wielding herd of monkeys, or of primitive men, or an organization of men united in clans. But such an organization would still be possible. Yet it is impossible because civilized society is split into antagonistic and moreover irreconcilably antagonistic classes. Any arming of them for self-motivating purposes would lead to an armed struggle between them. A state is formed, a special power is created, and special bodies of armed men, and every revolution, by destroying the state apparatus, brings it vividly home to us how the ruling class strives to restore the special bodies of armed men which serve it, and how the oppressed class strives to create a new organization of this kind, capable of serving not the exploiters, but the exploited. It is with the above-mentioned argument that Engels raised theoretically the very same question which every great revolution poses before us, in practice visibly and, moreover, on the plane of mass action, namely the question of the relation between special bodies of armed men and the self-motivating armed organization of the population. We shall see how this question is concretely illustrated by the experience of the European and Russian revolutions, but let us return to Engels' presentation. He points out that sometimes, for example, in areas of North America, this public power is weak, and here he is touching on a rare exception in capitalist society by referring to those parts of North America in its pre-imperialist days where the free colonists predominated, but that generally speaking, it grows stronger. Engels continues. The public power grows stronger to the extent that class contradictions within the state become more acute, and to the extent that adjacent states become larger and more populated. Just take a look at present-day Europe, where class struggle and the scramble for conquests have winched up the public power to such a pitch that it threatens to devour the whole society and even the state. This was written not later than the beginning of the 1890s. Engels' last preface was dated the 16th of June, 1891. The turned towards imperialism, meaning the complete domination of the trusts, meaning the omnipotence of the big banks, meaning the massive colonial policy, and so forth, was only just beginning in France and was even weaker in North America and in Germany. Since then, the scramble for conquest has made gigantic strides forward, especially as by the beginning of the second decade of the 20th century, the whole world had finally divided up among these rivals and conquests. That is, among the great predatory powers. Since then, armaments for land and naval warfare have undergone unimaginable growth in the predatory war of 1914 through 1917. That's World War I. For the domination of the world by England or Germany, for the division of the spoils, has brought all the forces of society to the brink of complete catastrophe, as they are devoured by rapacious state power. As early as 1891, Engels was able to point to scramble for conquest as one of the most important distinguishing features of the foreign policy of the great powers. But in 1914 to 1917, when this rivalry has become many times more intense and given rise to an imperialist war, the social chauvinist scoundrels cover up the defense of the predatory interests of their own land. Of their own bourgeoisie with phrases about the defense of the fatherland, defense of the republic and the revolution, etc. Part 3 of Chapter 1. The state as an instrument for the exploitation of the oppressed classes. Taxes and state loans are needed for the maintenance of the special public power standing above society. Engels writes, in possession of the public power and of the right to levy taxes, the bureaucrats as organs of society now stand above society. I have to burp. The free voluntary respect that was accorded to the organs of the Gentile clan society does not satisfy them, even if they could win it. Special laws are enacted proclaiming the sanctity and inviolability of bureaucrats. The most pitiful police official has more authority than the representatives of the clan, but even the head of the military power of a civilized state could well envy an elder of a clan, enjoying the uncoerced respect of society. Here, the problem of the privileged position of the officials as organs of state power is raised. The main question indicated is, what is it that places them above society? We shall see how this theoretical question has resolved in practice by the Paris Commune in 1871, and how it was fudged in a reactionary fashion by Kautsky in 1912. As the state arose from the need to hold class antagonisms in check, and as it arose at the same time in the midst of conflicts among these classes, it is as a rule the state of the most powerful, economically dominant class in Testing. Sorry, we lost power there for a second for some reason. Where was I? Fuck. We'll just continue here. Not only were the ancient and feudal states organs for the exploitation of slaves and serfs, but, he quotes Engels, the modern representative state is an instrument of exploitation of wage labor by capital. By way of exception, however, periods occur in which the warring classes attain such an equilibrium of forces that state power for a time acquires a certain independence in relation to both classes as an ostensible mediator. Such were the absolute monarchies of the 17th and 18th centuries, the Bonapartism of the First and Second Empires in France, Bismarck in Germany. Such, we may add, is the Kerensky government in Republican Russia, now that it has proceeded to persecute the revolutionary proletariat at a moment when the Soviets, thanks to the leadership of the petty bourgeois Democrats, have already become impotent, while the bourgeoisie is not yet strong enough simply to disperse them. In a democratic republic, Engels continues, wealth exercises its power indirectly, but all the more surely, firstly by means of the direct bribery of bureaucrats, so that's in America, and secondly, by means of an alliance between the government and stock exchange, and he references both France and America on this one. At the present time, imperialism and the domination of the banks have developed both these methods of supporting and realizing the omnipotence of wealth in democratic republics of all descriptions into an exquisite art. Let us take, for example, the very first months of the Russian Democratic Republic. One might call it the honeymoon after the socialist SRs and Mensheviks were joined in wedlock to the bourgeoisie. Sorry, when he says socialist, it's in quotes. He's saying they're not actually socialists. He's mocking them. Were joined in wedlock to the bourgeoisie in a coalition government. If Mr. Palczynski obstructed every measure intended to curb the capitalists and their marauding practices, their pillaging of the treasury by means of war contracts, and if later on Mr. Palczynski resigned from the ministry, only to be replaced, of course, by another Palczynski of exactly the same type, and if the capitalists rewarded him with a nice little job at a salary of 120,000 rubles per annum, what would you call this? Direct or indirect bribery? An alliance between the government and the syndicates, or merely friendly relations? Question mark. What role do the Chernovs, Zertelis, or Avkansitevs and Skobelevs play? Gosh, I'm sorry, I'm not good at reading Russian names. Are they the direct or only the indirect allies of the millionaire robbers of the treasury? The reason why the omnipotence of wealth is better secured in a democratic republic is that it is not only subject to any particular faults of the political mechanism or to any defective political shell of capitalism. A democratic republic is the best possible political shell for capitalism, and therefore once capital has got control of this excellent shell, so that could be through the Palczynskis, Chernovs, Zertelis, and co. He's saying there's a type of person who's easily bribed, and these are people who have been examples of bribable people. It establishes its power so securely, so firmly, that no change of individuals, of institutions, or of parties in the bourgeois democratic republic can shake this also necessary to note that Engels is most definite in naming even universal suffrage as an instrument of bourgeois rule. Universal suffrage, he says, obviously considering the long experience of German social democracy, is the gauge of the majority of the working class, and neither can nor will give any more in the present-day state. Petty bourgeois Democrats such as our SRs and Mensheviks, as well as their twins, namely all the social chauvinists and opportunists of Western Europe, expect just this bit more from universal suffrage. They themselves partake of and instill into the minds of the people the false notion that universal suffrage in the present-day state is capable of expressing the will of the majority of laboring people and of securing its implementation. Here we can only mention this false notion, only indicate that Engels' perfectly clear, precise, and concrete statement is distorted at every point in the propaganda and agitation of the official, that is, opportunists, socialist parties. A detailed exposure of the utter falsity of this notion, which Engels brushes aside here, is given in our further account of the views of Marx and Engels on the present-day state. Engels gives a general summary of his views in the most popular of his works in the following words. Thus, the state has not existed for all eternity. There have been societies that did without it, that had no conception of the state and state power. At a certain stage of economic development, which was necessarily bound up with the cleavage of society into classes, the state became a necessity because of this cleavage. We are now rapidly approaching a stage in the development of production at which the existence of these classes not only will have ceased to be a necessity, but will become a direct hindrance to the production. Classes will disappear as inevitably as they inevitably arose at an earlier stage. With the disappearance of classes, the state too will inevitably disappear. Society organizing production on the basis of a free and equal association of the producers will dispatch the whole state machine, whither it will then belong, to the Museum of Antiquities, side by side with the spinning wheel and the bronze axe. We do not often come across this passage in the literature of propaganda and agitation of contemporary social democracy, but even when we do come across the passage, it is mostly quoted in the spirit of what is this word? Oh my god. Obeisance before an icon, that is, as an expression of official respect for Engels, without any attempt at assessing the broad and deep scale of the revolution presupposed by this dispatch of the whole state machine to the Museum of Antiquities. Usually we cannot discern even an understanding of what Engels calls the state machine. Part 4. The withering away of the state and violent revolution. But before I do that, I'm going to drink my thing. Okay. Engels' words on the withering away of the state are so widely famous, are so often quoted, and so vividly reveal the reveal the gist of the conventional adulteration of Marxism to look like opportunism that we must deal with them in detail. We shall quote the whole argument from which they are taken. The proletariat seizes state power and transforms the means of production in the first place into state same act, it puts an end to itself as proletariat and to class distinctions and antagonisms. It puts an end to the state as a state. The society which has existed and exists to this day, which moves within class antagonisms, had need of the state, that is, an organization of the exploiting classes, for the maintenance of its external conditions of production, and therefore especially for the forcible retention of the exploiting class in the conditions of oppression. So that is slavery, serfdom, or wage labor, determined by the given mode of production. The state was the official representative of society as a whole, its concentration in a visible corporation. But it was this only insofar as it was the state of that class which alone, in its epoch, represented society as a whole. In antiquity, it was the state of citizen slave owners. In the Middle Ages, of the feudal nobility. In our times, of the bourgeoisie. When the state finally becomes truly the representative of society as a whole, it makes itself superfluous. God, sorry, I'm having trouble reading. Superfluous. As soon as there is no longer any class of society to be held in subjection, as soon as, along with class domination and the struggle for individual existence brought by the present-day anarchy of production, the conflicts and excesses arising from these have also disappeared. There will be nothing left to suppress, nothing requiring the special force for suppression, a state. The first act by which the state steps forward truly as the representative of society as a whole, the taking possession of the means of production in the name of society, is at the same time its last independent act as a state. The interference of state power in social relations becomes superfluous in one sphere after another, and then ceases of itself. The government of persons is replaced by the administration of things and the direction of the process of production. The state is not abolished, it withers away. It is on this basis that it is proper to evaluate the phrase about a free people's state, a phrase which has had a temporary justification for agitational ends, but in the ultimate analysis is scientifically inadequate. Sorry, my neck is cracking. It is on this basis that it is proper also to evaluate the demand of the so-called anarchists that the state should be abolished overnight. This is pulled from Anti-Düring, Herr Eugen Düring's Revolution in Science, which is a mocking title that Engels, I believe Engels wrote this book. It may be said without fear of error that out of Engels' entire argument, with its remarkable richness of ideas, the only real legacy of socialist thought found in modern socialist parties is the idea that, according to Marx, the state withers away, in contrast to this anarchist doctrine of the abolition of the state. This hacking back of Marxism essentially reduces it to opportunism, for such an interpretation only leaves a vague notion of slow, uninterrupted gradual change, of an absence of leaps and storms, of an absence of revolution. The currently widespread and popular concept, if such a word may be used, of the withering away of the state undoubtedly amounts to a playing down, if not a repudiation of revolution. Such an interpretation, however, is the crudest distortion of Marxism, advantageous only to the bourgeoisie. It is the base in terms of theory on the disregard for the most important circumstances and considerations indicated, for instance, in the summary argument by Engels, which we have just quoted in full. In the first place, Engels, at the very outset of his argument, says that in seizing state power, the proletariat by the same act puts an end to the state as a state. It is not considered quite proper to ponder over the meaning of this. Usually it is either completely ignored or is considered to be something in the nature of an Hegelian weakness on Engels' part. In fact, these words succinctly express the experience of one of the greatest proletarian revolutions, the Paris Commune of 1871, of which we shall speak in greater detail in its appropriate place. In fact, Engels speaks here of the proletarian revolution eradicating the bourgeois state, and the words about the state withering away refer to the remnants of the proletarian state after the socialist revolution. According to Engels, the bourgeois state does not wither away, but it is eradicated by the proletariat in the course of the revolution. It is the proletarian state or semi-state which withers away after this revolution. Secondly, the state is a special force for suppression. Engels gives this splendid and extremely profound definition here with the utmost clarity, and it follows from the definition that the special repressive force for the suppression of the proletariat by the bourgeoisie of millions of laboring people by a handful or two of the wealthy must be replaced by a special repressive force for the suppression of the bourgeoisie by the proletariat, i.e., the dictatorship of the proletariat. This is the very nub of the eradication of the state as a state. This is precisely the act of taking possession of the means of production in the name of society. It is self-evident that such a replacement of one, so replacing the bourgeois special force with another special force, that is, the proletarian one, cannot possibly take place in the form of a withering away. Thirdly, in speaking of the state withering away, and in even more vivid and colorful language, ceasing of itself, Engels refers quite clearly and definitely to the period after the state's expropriation of the means of production in the name of the whole of society, i.e., after the socialist revolution. We all know that the political form of the state at the time is the fullest democracy, but it never enters the head of any of the opportunists who shamefully distort Marxism that Engels is consequently speaking here of democracy ceasing of itself or withering away. This seems very strange at first sight, but it is incomprehensible only to those who have not taken account that democracy is also a state, and that consequently democracy will also appear when the state disappears. Democracy will also disappear when the state disappears. Revolution alone can eradicate the bourgeois state. The state in general, i.e. the fullest democracy, can only wither away. Fourthly, after formulating his famous proposition that the state withers away, Engels all at once explains concretely that this proposition is directed against both the opportunists and the anarchists. At the same time, Engels gives priority to the conclusion drawn from the proposition that the state withers away, which is directed against the opportunists. It is worth a bet that out of every 10,000 persons who have read or heard about the withering away of the state, 9,990 are completely unaware probably 9 do not know the meaning of a free people's state or why an attack on this slogan constitutes an attack on the opportunists. This is how history is written up. This is how the great revolutionary doctrine is imperceptibly counterfeited and adapted to the prevailing Philistinism. The conclusion directed against the anarchists has been repeated thousands of times, vulgarized, drummed into people's heads in the most simplistic fashion, and has acquired the strength of a prejudice. And the conclusion directed against the opportunists has been fudged and forgotten. The Free People's State was a programmed demand and a widely current slogan of the German Social Democrats in the 1870s. This slogan is devoid of all political content except for a Philistine and impassioned description of the concept of democracy. Insofar as it hinted in a legally permissible manner at a democratic republic, Engels was willing to justify its use for a time from an agitational viewpoint, but it was an opportunist slogan, for it expressed not only a glorification of bourgeois democracy, but also a misunderstanding of the socialist criticism of the state in general. We are in favor of a democratic republic as the best form of the state for the proletariat under capitalism. But we have no right to forget that wage slavery is the lot of the people, even in the most democratic bourgeois republic. Furthermore, every state is a special force for the suppression of the oppressed class. Consequently, every state is unfree and non-popular. Marx and Engels frequently explained this to their party comrades in the 1870s. Fifthly, this very same work by Engels, with its universally remembered argument on the withering away of the state, also contains an argument on the significance of violent revolution. Engels' historical evaluation of its role becomes a veritable panegyric on violent revolution. No one remembers about this. It is not considered proper in contemporary socialist parties to talk or even think about the significance of this idea, and it plays no part whatever in their daily propaganda and agitation among the masses. And yet, it is inseparably connected in a seamless web with the withering away of the state. Here is Engels' argument. That force plays another role in history, other than its perpetrator of evil, namely a revolutionary one. That is, in Marx's words, the midwife of every old society when it is pregnant with the new, that it is the instrument whereby the social movement forces its way through and shatters the petrified dead political forms. There is not a word of this in Herr Düring. It is only with sighs and groans that he admits the possibility that force will perhaps be necessary for the overthrow of the economic system of exploitation. Unfortunately, if you will, because all use of force verily demoralizes the person who uses it, and this is said despite the immense moral and spiritual upsurge which has resulted from every victorious revolution. And this is said in Germany, where the violent collision may indeed where a violent collision, which indeed may be forced on the people, would at least have the advantage of expunging the spirit of servility, which has permeated the national consciousness of consequence of the humiliation of the 30 Years' War. And this lifeless, insipid, and impotent way of thinking dares to propose itself to the most revolutionary party which history has known. How can this panegyric, I'm totally mispronouncing this, I feel like, panegyric on violent revolution pressed insistently by Engels upon the German Social Democrats between 1878 and 1894, that is right through to his death, be combined with the theory of the withering away of the state to form a single doctrine. Usually the two are combined with the help of eclecticism and by an unprincipled or sophistic selection made arbitrarily or to please the powers that be, of now one, now another argument, and in 99 cases out of 100, if not more often, it is the idea of the withering away that is placed in the foreground. Dialectics are replaced by eclecticism. This is the most conventional and widespread phenomenon in present-day official social democratic literature in relation to Marxism. Such a substitution is, of course, no novelty. It was observed even in the history of classical Greek philosophy. With the fraudulent substitution of opportunism for Marxism, it becomes the very easiest way to deceive the masses by substituting eclecticism for dialectics. This gives an illusory satisfaction. It seems to take into account all sides of the process, all tendencies of development, all the conflicting influences, and so forth, and yet in reality it presents no integral and revolutionary understanding of the process of social development at all. We have already said above, and shall later show in greater detail, that the doctrine of Marx and Engels about the inevitability of a violent revolution refers to the bourgeois state. The latter cannot be superseded by the proletarian state, the dictatorship of the proletariat, through the process of withering away, but as a general rule only through a violent revolution. The panegyric sung in its honor by Engels fully corresponds to Marx's repeated declarations. Let us recall the end of the poverty of philosophy in the Communist Manifesto, with their proud and open proclamation of the inevitability of violent revolution, and let us also recall what Marx wrote nearly 30 years later in criticizing the Gotha program of 1875, when he mercilessly castigated the opportunist character of that program. This panegyric is by no means a mere impulse, a mere declamation, or a polemic démarche. The necessity of systematically imbuing the masses with this view, and no other view of violent revolution, lies at the root of all doctrines of Marx and Engels. The betrayal of their teaching by the predominant social chauvinist and Kautskyite trends of today is expressed in striking relief by the neglect of such propaganda and agitation by both these trends. The replacement of the bourgeois state by the proletarian state is impossible without a violent revolution. The eradication of the proletarian state, that is, the eradication of the state as such, is impossible except through the process of withering away. A detailed and concrete development of these views was given by Marx and Engels when they studied each separate revolutionary situation and analyzed the lessons of the experience of each particular revolution. We shall now move on to this, undoubtedly the most important part of their doctrine, and that's the end of chapter 1. I hope you guys have enjoyed this reading. first chapter of The State and Revolution by Vladimir Lenin. I quite enjoyed it. I think he's very good at explaining things, but he's kind of he's a smart guy. He was a very smart guy. So, anyway, thank you for listening. If you could, like and subscribe. Maybe I'll do more readings. I prefer to do, if I'm doing nonfiction, I prefer to do pretty far left-leaning stuff. That's kind of just where I sit. That's the stuff that interests me. But I'm happy to read about, like, history and other stuff like that. So, anyway, thank you for watching.